History was made this past week when former President Donald Trump was arrested and charged with 34 felony counts in New York. Now, the charges stem from hush money payments paid to an adult film star. Trump pleaded not guilty. And for more on the legal aspects of these charges, we want to bring in Georgetown law professor and former federal prosecutor Mushtaq Gunja. Thank you very much for being with us here this morning. People have been, hearing about this over the last couple of days, and they've been told that these are felonies, but we've also heard these are the lowest level of felony that can be charged. What does that mean, and does that matter as to whether the seriousness of this?
Oh, sure. No, I think these are quite serious charges, actually. These sorts of books and records charges are often charged as misdemeanors, and that's fine. That's bread and butter sort of New York, Manhattan DA work. And the reason that these are important is, these charges, making sure that books and records are accurate, are sort of the foundation of making sure that our financial system works, our banking system works. And so I think there's no question that they're serious, but they are often charged as misdemeanors. They become felonies once those falsification of those records are done in the furtherance of some other crime.
It has been said that there are some sexy aspects to this story and some not so sexy aspects of this, but it seems like the not so sexy aspects of this are involved in the paperwork and the documents. As a former federal prosecutor, how big of an advantage is it to you if you're prosecuting a case if you have paper records that show exactly what took place?
Yeah, it definitely helps make the case. You don't need to rely as much on witnesses when you actually have the documents. And I think, from what I've seen from the indictment, the case is pretty factually strong. The records are there. They appear to be false. It would be pretty difficult for President Trump to say that the records were accurate. I mean, the payments to Michael Cohen were alleged as legal documents, but they weren't. They were for other purposes, it appears.
Why is this a crime?
Yeah, so, making sure that businesses are properly recording what their revenues and expenses are incredibly important. So we just saw this happen in Silicon Valley Bank, right? Right. If there is fraud, if we are not telling the public accurately what the records are, well, our whole financial system is at risk. So it's quite important that our records be accurate. It's quite important that somebody enforce that.
One of the things that was speculated about before this arraignment the other day is whether or not the judge would put a gag order on former President Trump. Now, obviously, that did not happen. What happens, besides the person not being able to speak about this, why are gag orders used? And what are judges trying to accomplish when they order them?
Yeah, it's a great question. So with gag orders, you're really trying to ensure that the parties, both the prosecution and the defense, are not adversely impacting a potential jury, right? And so I think what we're trying to do, what a judge might want to do, is just ensure that the jury is impartial. In this case, after sort of post-January 6th, I think a judge might have also considered whether or not there would be some sort of uprising. Not something that you would typically consider, but, with a former president, potentially.
But, the former president did go on and have a very long news conference or statement that Tuesday night. From a defendant's standpoint, is there an advantage to having a gag order in place? Because if you're somebody who's running for president and the press is asking you about this, you could simply fall back and say, well, I can't talk about it. There's a gag order.
Well, it's tricky because I think this is where politics and law sort of come and start butting heads a little bit, right? Because it may be politically advantageous for President Trump to say that, it's just the Democrats that are sort of after me, there's nothing here. His lawyers probably would prefer President Trump not to say anything about the case, because the more that a defendant talks about the case, the fewer avenues they have for potential defenses.
One of the things his lawyers have said, though, is that they would like to explore the possibility of a move of venue in this trial. It's located in Manhattan right now, traditionally a Democratic voting stronghold. They are raising the possibility that it gets moved to another borough of New York City, and that would be Staten Island, which has had more of a history of voting in Republicans. How likely is that a change of venue could be explored in this? Because if you're talking talking about a former president of the United States, it doesn't really seem to matter whether or not you're in Manhattan or Staten Island as to whether or not people know about this case or have comment.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think that I think it is quite likely that the president and his legal team move to change venue. I think it is quite unlikely that that motion is granted for the reasons that you said. I mean, what a judge really needs to do is find 12, 18 really impartial jurors. You know, Manhattan has a couple of million people, Staten Island has another 500, but there's no question, no reason to think that a judge is not going to be able to find 18 people in Manhattan that can be impartial.
The former president has not been shy about attacking the DA Bragg in this case. He has also had things to say about the judge as well. If this case were ultimately to not fall in the former president's favor, could the statements that the former president himself has made about the judge be used in a possible appeal?
It certainly, I think it would depend a little bit on what the grounds for the appeal are. And this is a little bit of the trick of sort of talking about this so early without knowing exactly what the discovery is going to look like. It's a little bit hard to know what the possible appeals might be, but you know, can't wait to see.
I think we're going to have ample opportunity to continue to talk about this as it goes on, though. We appreciate you coming in for visiting this Sunday. We look forward to having you back.
Yeah, thank you.
All right.